Alright, everyone. So, I'll be creating a new series. I'll be basically, recording videos about a different class now. Instead of AP World History, this is, American AP Government. This is Chapter 2 of this textbook that you see on the screen right here. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 will comprise Unit 1, at least that's the way my AP World History teacher organizes it. I mean, AP Government teacher organizes it. But even if your teacher organizes the units differently, the chapter of it, the fact that I'll be going by chapter means that you can still apply these videos to your class as well. So, we'll be doing, so here in this video, obviously, we'll be covering Chapter 2, which covers the formation of the American government and the U.S. Constitution. So, obviously, now everything needs to have an origin, and our Constitution has that. The earliest influences are obviously the Babylonian civilization with Hammurabi's Code, the Bible, biblical law like the Ten Commandments, and the Roman Republic. You also had English traditions like ordered government, an ordered limited government that was also representative. And to really get us started and to kind of reinforce this, we'll study a question that may not seem entirely relevant, but actually is quite important to see why where did America's governmental traditions come from. And this question covers why did the U.S. and Canada do so well while Latin America, which relied on the Spanish governmental system, did so poorly for so long. It's a good question to ask, because Spain and Portugal had the same biblical and Roman roots as England, but, England actually had pluralism. Now, don't think this is as ethnic pluralism or cultural pluralism. England was still incredibly intolerant towards Catholics, just like Spain and Portugal were incredibly intolerant towards non-Catholics, like Protestants. But what I mean by pluralism that other social groups, rather than just the landowners or the king, basically other social groups, rather than just other social groups rather than just the king and the landowners also had rights. Now you're wondering, why did England have pluralism? It's because of all the religious wars. For example, the English Civil War, and that kind of just showed to the English, hey, we gotta get along with each other, or we're just gonna kill each other into oblivion. The other reason was that the merchants, basically shoved their way into power, and thus the landed aristocrats had to concede some of the power to the merchants. So, the first inklings of English pluralism are in 1215 with the Magna Carta. Basically, King John has to give up some power to the nobility. Now, like I said, this pluralism does not necessarily mean the pluralism as it means today. Like I said, the king just gave up power to the nobility, not to the common folk, and not to, people of different faiths or cultures. That would come much later. But, we have to start somewhere. You also got it with the English Civil War from the 1630s to 1640s, with King Charles trying to become an absolutist monarch, and Parliament trying to resist him. Parliament published the petition of, and Parliament fighting back with a petition of rights. You also the Glorious Revolution in 1680 and 1689, with William and Mary being invited by Parliament rather than Parliament being invited by the King to rule. This established the concept of parliamentary supremacy, in which basically a somewhat representative body. Remember, you were only represented in Parliament if you were a rich white male aristocrat. But basically, the fact that the Parliament, a somewhat representative body that is elected by people other than just the landed aristocrats or the king, could actually have power over the monarchs. They also established this. You also see the invention of the English Bill of Rights. You see these ideas carry over in the Mayflower Compact, which was basically the proto-constitution that the guys who came over in the Mayflower came up with as a form of self-government, the House of Burgesses, which was Virginia's legislature, and the early state constitutions, especially Virginia's. This is just a timeline of Sydney's landmark early documents. That would have an influence on our Constitution, like the Magna Carta, English Bill of Rights, and the Virginia Bill of Rights. And these numbers indicate what kind of important things were invented in which documents and which ones, and and when did they carry over to our current documents. And as you can see, the Bill of Rights is just a compilation of the Virginia Bill of Rights, English Bill of Rights, and the Magna Carta. So the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, just didn't come out of nowhere. Obviously, the drive towards American self-government would be further accelerated by British colonial policies. British colonial policies. Until the mid-1700s, the colonies had a great deal of autonomy for the local governments from the English monarchy because they were distracted with all their wars, like the 7 Years' War. This was known as the status of salutary neglect. However, in 1760, needing money to pay off all their debts from the 7 Years' War, as well as the cost of maintaining their newfound empire, the young King George III tried to impose new taxes and laws on the colonists, thus trying to end this process of this status of salutary neglect. Now, the colonists cried foul, specifically no taxation or representation. And it's an interesting question to ask, why didn't the king just grant some representation to the colonists? Because the colonists would have been outvoted no matter what in Parliament, even if they did, but they probably wouldn't have revolted because at least they knew their voices were being heard in Parliament, and that the taxes that the taxes that were being imposed on them, they at least had a say in dictating them. And, of course, the king refused to grant them representation because, America is independent. It's an independent country now. And, it basically spurs on the rallying cry, give me liberty or give me death. This is only further accelerated by additional British policies. For example, the Stamp Act of 1765 caused 9 of 13 colonists to join together to resist in the Stamp Act Congress. They sent a declaration of rights and grievances to the king. However, this was not a declaration of independence. The colonies still wanted to remain a part of the British Empire, but they just were like, hey, buddy, you gave us all these rights a long time ago. Can we keep those rights? The Stamp Act was, in response, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but new laws were passed. And, these would often, long story short, the increased tensions would lead to the Boston Massacre in 1770. Samuel Adams starting the Committees of Correspondence in 1772, which were basically assemblies of representatives in each colony communicating with each other of how to coordinate boycotts and protests against the British. And one of the most famous examples of these protests is the Boston Tea Party in 1773, which, as we know, is immortalized in American historical canon. Another major colonial-wide, transcolonial, assembly would be the First Continental Congress, which would become a predecessor for the Second Continental Congress and later and future assemblies of various state representatives. This assembly was spurred by the Intolerable Acts of 1774, which were enacted in response to the Boston Tea Party. The delegates that attended this Continental Congress were some of the most preeminent preeminent individuals of this time period, like George Washington, Adams, John Jay, and Patrick Henry. They formally protested the king, but also they called for boycotts. Again, they're not calling for independence yet. They're still protesting. They agreed to meet again in spring of 1775 to discuss any further developments of the situation and to see if the situation improved. And unfortunately, it didn't, because now we have the Second Continental Congress, which would eventually declare independence. Now, it's important to remember that, when the Second Continental Congress convened, the American War of Independence had already kicked off. The first battles the first shots in Concord and Lexington had already been fired at, by May of 1775. This is the shot heard around the world. And the Second Continental Congress, created the Continental Army and said it would be commanded by George Washington. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Hancock would also join the team, and this would serve as our first national government. Because the Second Continental Congress would be the one that would finally declare independence from Britain with the Declaration of Independence. As we all know, the famous date, July 4th, 1776, that famous line of the Declaration that that we all know. We hold these truths. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And if you know European history well enough, especially that of the Enlightenment, you'll see that this actually originates from the social contract idea, especially from John Locke. That, basically what this is saying is that, there are natural rights that men are imbued with by whomever, like the Almighty Creator, and that's the government's responsibility, and that the social contract between the people and the government is that the government is supposed to protect the people as well as protect their rights, and that if the government fails to do that, the people have the right to overthrow it. That's basically the whole premise of the Declaration of Independence. And there was nothing like this in the entire history of the world. I mean, previously it was just monarchs said anything they want. Monarchs could dictate anything, they could dictate something and people had to follow it. This is totally something different. It's like, no, if we don't like this government, if it's being oppressive, we have the right to overthrow it. Now the idea of constitutions, they were already on the ground well before the Declaration of Independence. The states were starting to write them. They all focused on the popular sovereignty or the consent of the governed. Basically, our legitimacy and our power derives from the people. Of course, disclaimer, as we all know, that definition of people only included white, rich males, who owned a lot of property. But, I mean, compared for the time, that was pretty significant. Now, some states actually expanded the franchise to all white males to actually elect special constitutional assemblies, further giving the state governments legitimacy. They also had bills of rights, separation of powers, and checks and balances. All three of these principles would go on to play a major role in the founding of the modern nationwide constitution. Now, interestingly, most of them called for a weak executive and a strong legislature because they've had some bad experience. These states had a lot of bad experiences with royal governors that were directly appointed by the crown. These were basically laboratories for these states' constitutions were the laboratories for the Articles of Confederation and the later Constitution. Now, our first, one of our first experiments in national government was the Articles of Confederation. Well, although its technical name was the Articles of Confederation Perpetual Union. However, as we all know, this name was pretty much an oxymoron. The Continental Congress created the Articles of Confederation as kind of a league of friendship, rather than a centralized national government. Rather, it was just a loose alliances of 13, semi-independent sovereign states, kind of like how the European Union works today, but much more decentralized than even the EU is. The Articles were improved in 1777 and ratified in 1781. They had a very simple structure, just a unicameral or one-house legislature with an annually selected presiding officer, known as the president. However, this president had very little power. And, this lack of power would also extend to that of the government as a whole. The only powers the government had were make war and peace, send and receive ambassadors, make treaties, borrow money, establish post offices, build a navy, raise an army. However, it had to ask states for troops. It could not have a standing army, fix uniform weights and measures, and settle disputes among states. However, you might wonder, the problem is a lot of these things could not be done because a lot of these powers that were even given to the Articles government could not be properly executed by this new national government because it just simply was too weak. For example, make treaties. Often the Articles government had so little control over the states that often states would enact their own foreign policies. Or building a navy. That was simply impossible because as we can see, the Articles government could not tax. And so how the heck are you going to pay for a new navy if you can't tax? So, like I said, one of the biggest weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation was the inability to tax. So it couldn't collect, it couldn't raise tax revenues to raise an army, to raise a military, or do anything for that matter. And it could only get money by begging states for money, and obviously the states just said no. Also, like, because the Articles government had so little power, it couldn't even regulate trade between the states, which is one of the aforementioned powers given to the Articles government. It could not make states to obey the treaties or what the Articles government said. It took 9 out of 13 states just to make laws, so that was basically impossible. And it took 100% of states to agree to amendments or changes to the Articles. So basically, you could get absolutely nothing done in the Articles government. And this was the point. The states had just come off from fighting an independence war against the British, and they wanted a weak central government because they just fought against the monarchy. And George Washington pretty much pointed out, like, one of the biggest issues of the Articles government. What foreign country will actually deal with us on such terms when it creates a government so pathetically weak that it can't even control its own states? Now, the Articles wasn't a total failure. It actually managed to set up plans for the new Northwest Territories, for example, the Northwest Ordinance and the Land Ordinance. It also prohibited slavery in the new states. So yay, but it's also the reasoning behind it would not last for long, because they only prohibited slavery because tobacco was becoming less popular and that cotton hadn't taken over yet. The reason why tobacco is becoming less popular is that tobacco growing is actually quite ruinous for the soil. It drains a lot of nutrients, and a lot of the big plantation owners like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson realized that tobacco was not profitable, and cotton wasn't really big around this time. So the 1780s would become that critical period between 1776. When America declares its independence, and then 1791, I believe. 1780. Let me check something. Sorry, actually, never mind. Okay, my bad. So basically, the 1780s were that critical period between 1776, when Americans declared independence, and the late 1780s and the early 1790s, when the modern American government would come into power under George Washington, our first president. So, the war would end in 1781 just as the Articles were ratified. And without the common enemy of the British, the states just constantly quarreled with each other. Some made separate deals with foreign nations, despite the fact that they had no rights to do so. But the Articles government couldn't do anything about this because it was just too weak. Few were paid into the national government, so the national government was always broke. And some set of tariffs on each other. So, how I said, the Articles was kind of like a European Union. It was more of a really weak European Union, because even European Union countries, even to some extent, they can't set up tariffs on each other, although there are exceptions. What would finally teach many of the most prominent Americans, George Washington and and James Madison James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, that the Articles government was no longer tenable, was Shays Rebellion. Basically, in 1786, Daniel Shays, a former officer in the war, led a rebellion of economically desperate, indebted Western Massachusetts farmers. He forced several state judges to close their courts to prevent their properties from being taken away from them as a way to pay off their debts, because the state issued money was worthless. And in early 1787, he even attacked the federal arsenal. Eventually, the rebellion was put down, but this really sent a shockwave throughout America's political elite, because many of them were like, "Oh my God, we're going to disintegrate into open anarchy. We need a new government." So, as a result, wealthy creditors, or elites, led the charge for a stronger, more stable central government. This included the interesting mix of plantation owners, merchants, and financiers. Plantation owners, Washington, Madison. Merchants, John Hancock; financiers, Alexander Hamilton; Maryland, Virginia. The delegates, Maryland and Virginia, met at George Washington's plantation to deal with their own trade issues, which they successfully managed to do. Thus, the Virginia National General Assembly called for an all-states meeting to discuss trade issues at Annapolis in 1786. The turnout was pretty pathetic, but Hamilton and Madison managed to push for another meeting. The Articles Congress finally endorsed this in February of 1787, and a meeting was scheduled for May in Philadelphia. Now, the turnout here was much better. 12 of the 13 states showed up in Philadelphia. Now, Rhode Island refused because it was controlled by indebted small farmers who were helped by inflation and thus didn't want a strong central government that might have reduced inflation and thus hurt their financial interests. There were 55 total delegates, although there were only 42 who actually signed at the end. Jefferson and Adams were not there because they were ambassadors in Europe at the time, and yet the people the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were still some of the most talented, experienced, and educated people of their time, and many of them were quite young. Hamilton was 30 and Madison was 36. So anytime someone tells you, "Oh, you can't do much as a young person," just tell them that two of the most important figures in American history were only in their 30s when they essentially created a new government from the ground up. This, now, as a result of this, their importance, the founding fathers were kind of conferred this almost demigod status, as Jefferson put it. But it's important to remember that yes, they were brilliant people, but they were still human, and like humans, they make compromises, and we'll see the compromises they made later on, some of which were not very pleasant. Now, Patrick Henry stayed away because he smelled a rat, and he didn't really like the idea of a more centralized government. So the new Continental Congress, the new Constitutional Convention unanimously elected Washington as the president of the convention. Each state was given a vote, just like in the Articles of Confederation Congress, and a simple majority vote was all that was needed to agree on a topic. So to avoid the paralysis of the Articles Congress. They totally disregarded Congress's direction to propose amendments to the Articles, but they instead started from scratch. This was basically a runaway convention. You could even argue it was a coup d'etat or a putsch, but minus the bloodshed. So some of the proposals, there was a general agreement among the delegates that they needed to increase the power of the national government. But as they say, the devil was in the details. Most supported some form of Montesquieu-ish free branch approach. However, they differed on the exact details. Virginia, proposed a plan that would favor the big states. State representation would be based on the population or money provided. However, New Jersey proposed the plan that would favor the small states. All states were represented equally in the Congress, just like in the Articles Congress. Now, this dispute between small states and big states nearly killed the Constitutional Convention from taking off, and it could have just ended America's attempt at nation building right there and right then. But thankfully, the state of Connecticut came up with a compromise known as the Great Compromise, which explains why we have the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House representation was based on population, whereas the Senate, each state was represented equally. Delaware, for example, i.e., Delaware gets as many senators, 2, as New York. So this basically created a bicameral Congress. This is the one provision in the Constitution that cannot be amended without 100% agreement. So, sorry folks, if you want to change this, it's going to take a while. Now, how I said earlier that these guys were humans and that they made some compromises that weren't very good? Yeah, this is an example of that. The 3/5 compromise. The southern states originally wanted the slaves to fully count up to their representation in the House and the Electoral College, despite the fact that the slaves couldn't actually vote, because they knew that if they counted the state, because the South had a huge slave population, so if they counted them, they could get a big boost in the voting process. And as a compromise, the slaves, or who are euphemistically referred to as other persons, were counted as 3/5 of a person when determining state's population. Think about that. These guys, slaves couldn't even vote, and and yet they were somehow being represented, despite the fact that they had no say over the representatives. And to add insult to injury, they're being only counted as 3/5 of a person. Now, all the founders understood hypocrisy of slavery, but it was legal in 12 states, and many economies, especially in the South, were heavily dependent on them. But also, the North was also quite dependent on it as well, because, the slave trade was quite active. Many Northerners were quite active in the slave trade, as well as, the trade of goods produced by slaves, like sugar and molasses and whatnot. And the Three-Fifths Compromise was no small little thing. In fact, John Adams would have actually won re-election over Jefferson if the Three-Fifths Compromise had not existed. And like I said, slaves were key to the economies of South and North. We usually think it's only important to the South, and it was very important. But like I said, it was important to the North because the North was heavily dependent on trade, and the slave trade was a huge deal, as well as the fact that a lot of the goods produced in the South by slaves, tobacco, was regularly traded by Northern merchants. Now, you had precedents of this in the Articles of Confederation. Slavery. You still had slavery allowed in many states in the Articles of Congress. So, as we can see, we can see the sharp contrast between slave and no slave states. Up here in the North, very little of the population was actually slave, whereas in the South, a significant portion of the population was slave. And basically, both North and South heavily relied on this, rather unpleasant slave trade for their economies. The South would produce the raw materials that the North would use to make finished goods, which they would use to sell off to Europe, as well as the fact that Northern merchants would also trade in slaves and make money off of that. The Constitution was drafted in 92 secret sessions and sweltering heat. There were dozens more compromises and revisions, especially on the structure of Congress, how to choose a president, and the amount of power relative to the states. As Benjamin Franklin put it, it was like sawing boards to make them fit. But the broad agreement on the there was a broad agreement on the fundamentals of popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, and checks and balances. All 12 state delegations, both free individuals against, approved the final draft on September 17th, 1787, known as Constitution Day. So basically, the purpose of the government, as you can read this yourself, but basically we're going to create a government that's going to establish justice, assure peace, provide defend our country, help our people, and secure liberty and all the rights that we fought for. So, and here's some interesting, in terms of an overview of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, interestingly, is the oldest written constitution in the world. It provides a framework for the U.S. government, the principles, organization, selection process, procedures, and limits, but not detailed provisions. That's why it's actually one of the shortest constitutions in the world. For example, India's constitution is enormous, going into very extensive detail on many minute things, whereas the U.S. government constitution is just a basic skeleton framework. There's a preamble, 7 articles, and 27 amendments. You can read this thing in half an hour if you can somehow get through the really arcane and old English that they used. So the 7 articles of the Constitution covered, the basic fundamentals of American government. The first one covered the legislative branch, second, the executive branch, the third, judicial, fourth, relations among the states, fifth, amending the Constitution, the 6th article saying that the Constitution was the supreme law of the land, no state constitution could usurp it in terms of power, and the 7th, the whole process of ratifying the Constitution. The 6 principles governing the Constitution were popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, and federalism. Popular sovereignty is basically the idea that we, the people, are the only form of legitimacy. The government requires the consent of the governed, and that the mechanism to ensure that the people are representative is popularly elected representatives. Limited government is the idea that government can only do what the people have authorized it to do as part of the social contract. The government is not above the law, And additionally, the government is not above the law. It can't do whatever the heck it wants to do. Separation of powers is basically, each branch of government has their own unique set of powers. Rather than Britain, where in Britain the Parliament was all powers vested in Parliament, the legislative branch, since the Parliament chose the chief executive, the Prime Minister, as well as until recently held the Supreme Court, which was the House of Lords. Now, Americans wanted a more powerful government, but saw so much concentration of power in one branch as tyrannical. And they were proven correct when we saw what happened in the French National Assembly. It was basically an all-powerful unicameral or one-house legislature that could do whatever the heck it wanted. And as we all know, this basically devolved into a catastrophically imploding revolution that would, culminate in the French Terror and eventually the rise of Napoleon. In true in truth, the powers are not so much separated as shared. Checks and balances, basically more or less the idea, you can read it, you've probably heard of these before, but basically, basically each branch, can, stymie the power of another branch, so that, one branch doesn't become too powerful. They can all act as counterbalances to each other. This is a little nice diagram explaining it. You can pause the video and read this yourself. I'm not going to go over it. Chances are you probably already heard of this. Now, the whole checks and balances system really works best when one party controls both House and the presidency. Of course, as we all know, this has rarely happened in the past 50 years, though. But, gridlock isn't necessarily a terrible thing. Now, I'm not saying it's always a good thing. It can be a massive headache. However, gridlock can, prevent, one branch from accumulating too much power or doing something too crazy. Now, we've had a few. Now, there are some really ugly conflicts where the checks and balances system seems to come to a really heated clash, as we can see with the impeachment of Donald Trump. Executives completely ignoring laws, like Andrew Jackson completely ignoring the Supreme Court's decision on the fate of the Indians in the Supreme Court case Worcester versus Georgia, which basically said, hey, Andrew Jackson, you can't kick the Indians off their land. Jackson basically said, to heck with you, I will just ignore it. Yeah, this is one of the many reasons why Jackson's so controversial. He kind of, there's a reason why some people think he was quite authoritarian in that regard. Nixon demanding executive privilege in the fact that, by saying, because of executive privilege, I don't have to hand over my tapes. Gore versus Bush, and signing statements. Now, judicial review is a check that is so important it gets its own principle. Judges basically judge the constitutionality of government actions. This power wasn't explicitly stated in the Constitution. In fact, Article 3, the one governing judicial branch, is actually one of the shorter articles. However, this power was established in a Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison. And the Supreme Court basically, in many ways, would exercise and expand its power through court cases. So far, 150 acts of Congress and 1,200 state and local ordinances have been struck down by the Supreme Court. Federalism will be covered in the next chapter. However, what it basically is that there are powers that are reserved for the federal government and the state government that are mutually exclusive, as well as powers that are shared between the state and federal governments. Like I said, I'll go into more detail later on. It's kind of complicated. These are some graphical representations my teacher inserted for, the 6 principles: popular sovereignty, limited government, checks and balance, judicial review. I believe this is supposed to be checks and balances, federalism, popular sovereignty, limited government, checks and balances. I'm trying to think. So yeah, this is popular sovereignty, limited government. I'm forgetting one of the principles, but I think you can figure it out. You can figure it out. Now, Article 5 covers the process of actually amending the Constitution. Now, there are some different types of amendments. Informal amendments are very important, and we'll be discussing next section. But the amendments that we know of are the 27 formal amendments that have been ratified over the past 220 years. Now, you're thinking, oh wow, 27 formal amendments over 220 years, that's very little. Keep in mind, the Articles Congress approved no amendments because it approved all states to agree to them. There are 2 steps to ratify a formal amendment, each which can be done two ways, so there are 4 possible scenarios. Step 1 is that an amendment can be proposed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress or by 2/3 of state legislatures, who request Congress to call a national proposing convention. Step 2 is that it's ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures or 3/4 of states or 3/4 of state ratifying conventions. This is a nice little representation of how it could happen. However, almost all of the ratifications have been done by the top way. However, the only one that didn't happen this way was the not been the top way was to repeal the Prohibition Amendment with Amendment 21. Now, like there have been attempts to like to have a national constitutional, amending convention, as we saw, which is like one of the step, which is we can see like in this bottom step. It almost happened in 1980s for the balanced budget with 32, but it was so close. They were only 2 states off. Now, actually, interestingly, now of course there's a concern that the convention might go crazy and that might fall to the auspices of populism and mobocracy. However, keep in mind Thomas Jefferson and Woodrow Wilson certainly would have supported this. Maybe one of the proposals for our national constitutional amending convention is getting rid of a text with our original sin, basically references to slavery, or getting rid of our democracy deficits like gerrymandering and whatnot, or even more controversial, electoral college. I don't know. You can all decide. You can all debate that among yourselves. About AP government. So some key amendments are like the Bill of Rights, Amendment 1 to 10, that ensure the freedom of expression, fair policing and trials, retain rights and reserve powers. Reconstruction amendments that were proposed in the wake of the Civil War that granted black freedom, citizenship, and suffrage. Unfortunately, as we all know, these were, brutally quashed by white redeemer movements in the Deep South, who basically totally destroyed, black political rights, and it would take like another century of the Civil Rights Act for blacks and non-whites to get their rights back. You also have the Progressive Era amendments, which like with the income tax, with the introduction of the income tax, popular election of senators, prohibition, and women's suffrage. The second Reconstruction amendments, DC could vote for the president. This was important because DC at the time had a lot of African Americans, so it was quite by letting such a large a area of a large amount of African Americans to vote for president was kind of considered a way of giving blacks a bit more representation, as well as banning on poll taxes, which was one of the many ways the white redeemer governments prevented blacks from voting in the first place. As well, these would often be accompanied with the civil and voting rights laws. Number 14 is far and away the most important amendment. It forces states to adhere to federal guaranteed privileges and immunities, via its due process clause, eventually. However, this wasn't exactly implemented aggressively at the federal level by the federal government, because the Supreme Court was dominated by towards in the late 1800s, it was dominated by incredibly racist, reactionary, sovereign justices who basically just dragged their feet on implementing many of the rights guaranteed by these amendments guaranteeing the rights issued in the Constitution, to the residents of the states, particularly African Americans. This is called the Incorporation, or the Doctrine of Incorporation. We all know the Bill of Rights. If you want to pause the screen to read them yourselves, you can. I'm not going to read this out loud because you've probably seen this, and you can just read them on your own time. What's important is to remember that the Bill of Rights was basically an attempt by the United States to protect the rights of their citizens, to prevent the government from becoming tyrannical. And this is an interesting table showing how long it took for amendments to be ratified. So, this was interesting. Congressional pay, which is rather minor. The 27th Amendment, proposed by Madison, originally over 200, over a good 2 centuries ago, took 202 years to ratify. Now, like I said, the Constitution is really a skeletal outline. This virtually guarantees the need for interpretation. It needs to be read between the lines of the written and unwritten Constitution, especially impacted by passage of basic legislation by Congress, actions taken by the President, key Supreme Court decisions, activities of political parties, and custom and usage. The Constitution that has been alive, so to speak. Now, little disclaimer. These disclaimers are, now keep in mind, these disclaimers are always important to American history, because on one hand we have the lofty ideals, and on the other hand we have the ugly truth. The original Constitution, the way it was interpreted well into the 20th century, was incredibly racist and misogynistic and elitist by today's standards. This is our original sin, one that very much continues to haunt us to this very day. You've all read about slavery, civil, and the struggle for civil rights and racial equality. This basically would lay the original Constitution and its early interpreters basically laid the foundations for many of the problems that would plague America later on. As William Lloyd Garrison, the militant abolitionist, once put it, the Constitution was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. For 28 of the first 32 years of the Republic, the presidents were slave owners, even though they knew slavery was morally wrong. And to our greatest strength, and of course we can't forget our greatest disgraces, like the Three-Fifths Clause and the Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson cases. This one basically saying blacks are inherently inferior to whites, and this one basically saying, oh, segregation is cool. And overtly racist laws existed well into the 1970s. My government teacher actually worked in finance, and he said, yeah, we were still doing redlining. We were still enacting redlining policies that really screwed over potential black homeowners well into the 70s. And covertly racist laws are still being passed this hour. I'm pretty sure you can think of some, but an example would be North Carolina's congressional redistricting proposal. I think the Supreme Court basically struck it down, saying it was saying that it was it was basically surgically discriminatory towards blacks to basically eliminate them from political representation. And racism is still our bleeding ulcer that we are very much struggling with us to this day. And a little message to you all. My AP World History teacher said, contribute to eracism, or the erasing of racism. But we can't focus on this forever. We have to focus on the rest of government stuff. But keep this in mind. This is very important to have that back of your mind. So the ratification of the Congress was by simple majority of the state conventions, not the legislatures. If it were by the legislatures, it probably wouldn't have happened, because some states like New York were incredibly resistant to the ratification of the Constitution. The ratification, So I misphrased that. The ratification of the conventions of 9 states, supermajority of 69%, shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution. So basically, the conventions, by simple majority vote in 9 of the 13 states, if they approve the Constitution, it will be ratified. Interestingly and crucially, the Congress of the Confederation agreed to this irregular procedure. Now, almost immediately, citizens were divided between pro-Constitution Federalists and anti-Constitution Anti-Federalists. The ratifying process was the greatest exercise of democracy in the history of the world up to that point. The delegates were popularly elected rather than by state legislatures. And interestingly, property rights were waived in many states. Women in New Jersey voted, and interestingly, for once in our early history, free blacks could vote. So it's really, and actually personally, I did not know about these two. So it's very interesting that, in the earliest, inklings of American democracy, at least there was some attempt to be more inclusive in terms of voting. This enactment process added great legitimacy. It was very much the we the people. Oh, wait, what? Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. I thought it was not working. Okay. Sorry about that. All right. Gotta get back to it. Sorry. Oh boy. Okay, what the heck? Okay. All right. Sorry about this. Now, of course, like I said, the citizenry were very divided about this Constitution. Now, this little stuff up here is just like some, interesting things about the names of these two factions. These are some other like proposals by my, government teacher, but they're not really important. There was an incredibly vigorous and free debate among the population used to debating state constitutions. Perhaps the great example of limited franchise, keyword, democracy in action in history. It was a big part of our government's legitimacy. Of course, it was only limited franchise. Some call this free enactment process part of the unwritten Constitution itself. Now, there was vicious opposition to the Constitution. This is an example of a speech by an anti-federalist, basically saying, the Federalists have created a government so powerful it'll just swallow up all us poor illiterate people who will have no idea what's going on. So the Federalists counteracted with their own. The Federalists, in defense of the Constitution, wrote 85 essays in support of ratification, which were written under the pen name Publius, or Public Man. They were written by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, with the majority being written by Hamilton. If you actually read more about Hamilton, he's an interesting guy. This guy had a Herculean work ethic. These Federalist Papers were a great window into the thinking of the framers. In fact, the Supreme Court would frequently use the Federalist Papers when drafting their decisions in order to see what the founders thought originally. Federalist Papers 10, 51, 70, and 78 are some of the most important. Now, the anti-Federalists also responded with their own essays. There were many dozens of these, though they were not centrally organized. Some of them were under the pen name of Brutus, likely Robert Yates. Some under, the pen name the Federal Farmer, probably written by Richard Henry Lee. Anti-Federalist Brutus #1 illustrates one of the biggest arguments against the Constitution. Basically, it says that it argued the federal government had become so powerful and that it would just eliminate state powers entirely, and that those states would have a very hard time trying to get those powers back. He also argued that an extended republic is not as good at protecting liberty as smaller republics. Per Montesquieu and Beccaria, European authorities and experience. Basically, the author of his paper said, look, a lot of the past republics, they've been mostly small, Greece and Rome, and when they expanded, they basically just became dictatorships. So they're basically arguing, look, I don't know if we can really create a big republic. You think this author thought big republics will lead to tyranny because people don't have enough in common. A truly representative body would need to be too large to function. In order for the government to function, it would have become very centralized. It also lead to standing armies and other techniques that this author feared would lead to authoritarianism. Now, Madison responded with Federalist number 10. He argued big is better because the national government was better at preserving liberty than the state governments. There are lots of factions that check each other, and that multiple factions protects the rights of the minority. The Federalists, would win because we're living under the Constitution right now, but they had to make a significant compromise. They promised to add a Bill of Rights once the Constitution was in operation. The framers originally didn't really think it was necessary to have a Bill of Rights because there were already Bills of Rights in state constitution. Others said that these rights were already assumed. Now, interestingly, Woodrow Wilson said rights were not the issue. So, and an example of some of the rights guaranteed by the Constitution that were not in the Bill of Rights are, the writ of habeas corpus is protected. Basically, if I'm the government, I can't just arrest you when I want to. I need a reason to do so. No bills of attainder, no ex post facto laws. Basically saying, okay, let's just say I enact the law that I, as the government, enact the law. That says practice A is illegal. Well, now people who did practice A before the law was enacted will not be arrested just because it's now practice A is illegal. right of trial by jury. Hold on. Citizens of each state were entitled to the same privileges and immunities, and importantly, there were no religious qualifications for office. If you're wondering why they had this, it's because that the founding fathers, they had extensively studied European history, and one thing they found very disapproving was religious intolerance. Basically, governments like France, Spain, and even to some extent Britain, actually when you think about especially Britain, were had religious tests to prevent certain religious groups, whether they be Protestants, Catholics, Muslims, Jews, from attaining certain political positions. The founding fathers wanted to get rid of that, and so they said, the heck with that. If whatever religion you are, you can run for government. You can run for government. There is nothing excluding you from that. The required 9 states, now 9 states had already ratified it, but the required 9 states had already ratified it by, June 21st of 1788, but not the key states of Virginia and New York. They couldn't. The framers didn't want to enact it didn't want it to be enacted without their approval, because these two states were very important to the country. Without them, the country would simply collapse. So Madison finally got Jefferson's support in Virginia, which eventually tilted Virginia in favor of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton would lead the way in New York, but it barely passed by a free vote margin. North Carolina and Rhode Island didn't ratify until after the new government was in place. So basically, this is like a little map, showing how easily was it ratified and when was it ratified. This is basically ratification of the Constitution by date and the vote margins. And so, these are some perspectives on the Constitution. A machine that would go of itself, basically according to in the words of James Russell Lowell, that the Constitution is like a self-sustaining document that will create a government and a country that will edit itself and push it towards that famous phrase, a more perfect union. Patrick Henry denied that liberty could be preserved by what he dismissed as your species' imaginary balances, your rope dancing, chain rattling, ridiculous ideal checks and balances. Wilson believed that the Constitution's structural axioms failed to allow for growth and adaptation, hence he called for a government accountable to Darwin and not to Newton. And there has been and he also said there has been an enormous disjunction between Americans' sacred regard for the Constitution and their bottomless ignorance of it. And if you're wondering what the whole disbalance of power, what factions were being balanced here, well, here's some examples. Public order versus individual liberty, the people versus the government, national government versus state governments, large states or small states, one branch or the other branches. Sorry about the picture obscuring it, but basically the North or merchant-based states versus the agriculturally-based sovereign states, the debtors versus the creditors, the majority versus the minority, the Senate versus the House, bureaucracy and departments versus the executive and the legislature, the jury versus the judiciary. And that is that. It was a long and painstaking process, but finally we managed to reach the point where we have ratified the Constitution, and off we go into learning about American government. Thanks for watching.